This is how Berlin was rebuilt after WW2. The title appears over aerial shots of a sea of ruins, where streets vanish, sob mountains of broken brick and twisted steel. A grey haze of dust floats in the air, and lonely chimneys rise like gravestones over a destroyed capital. Here in 1945, Berlin seemed less a city than a colossal wound carved into the heart of Europe. From this devastation, a divided metropolis would slowly re-emerge, shaped by occupation troops, hunger, ideology, and the quiet determination of ordinary people. Between the end of the war and the dawn of the Cold War, Berlin passed from total collapse to a complex form of rebirth, an emblem of both destruction and reconstruction. Before the Second World War, Berlin was a vibrant capital, a place where trams rattled past theaters, crowded cafes, and modernist apartment blocks in the 1920s and 1930s. Wide boulevards like Unter den Linden and Friedrichstrasse framed views of grand monuments, while workers' housing estates with clean lines and open courtyards promised light air and sun to ordinary families. This was no provincial town, but a major European center of culture, science and political debate. At the same time, the city was already changing under the Nazi regime. Monumental ministries in stone replaced some modernist buildings, and entire neighborhoods were cleared to make way for future megalomaniac projects. Jewish-owned shops vanished from familiar streets, and fear spread quietly through apartment stairwells. Yet, to many Berliners, daily life still looked normal. Children went to school, cinemas were full, and the electric glow of nightlife continued above an increasingly dark political foundation. That contrast between apparent normality and the storm gathering overhead would make the coming collapse even more brutal. As the war advanced and Germany's enemies drew closer, Berlin's citizens did not yet know that their modern capital would soon become one of the most iconic examples of a city destroyed in the entire conflict. The bombing of Berlin turned maps into lies. Whole districts that once buzzed with tram bells and market cries became lines of shattered facades, their interiors open to the sky. Night after night, Allied aircraft crossed the clouds, their engines a distant growl that filled shelters with silent dread. Incendiary bombs triggered firestorms that sucked oxygen from underground cellars, while high explosives tore streets apart in seconds. The city's infrastructure collapsed as water, electricity, and transport lines were ripped to pieces. By the final phase of the war, the air attacks were joined by the ground assault. In the spring of 1945, Soviet artillery rained shells on Berlin, and the Battle of Berlin brought house-to-house fighting into already ruined streets. The capital of the Third Reich became a maze of barricades, craters, and improvised strongpoints. Civilians trying to reach water pumps or food distribution points moved carefully through this landscape, stepping over rubble and sometimes bodies. When the fighting ended, countless buildings were burned out, roofs gone, floors collapsed. The center of power of Nazi Germany had become a symbol of absolute ruins. For many survivors, it was impossible to imagine that this place could ever again be called a city. After the last shots faded, a strange silence fell over Berlin. Survivors climbed slowly out of cellars and air raid shelters, blinking into daylight that illuminated only broken walls and piles of brick. Streets were blocked by heaps of debris several meters high. Familiar landmarks had vanished behind a monotony of grey and brown. The skeletons of churches, factories, and apartment blocks stood like fragile teeth in a mouth smashed by a single gigantic blow. Hunger and exhaustion marked the faces of those who remained. Families searched for missing relatives, calling names into empty courtyards. In some places, fires still smoldered, and the smell of smoke mixed with the odor of death and sewage from shattered pipes. Children picked through rubble, hoping to find anything useful. A blanket, a pot, a surviving toy. This was the human reality behind the statistics of bomb tonnage and casualty numbers. In that silence, a difficult question took shape. Had Berlin itself been morally condemned to death, or could a new city rise where so much had collapsed? For many, the immediate concern was simpler and more brutal. There was no abstract future, only this day and the next, and the need to survive one more night among the ruins of a broken world. The choice to rebuild Berlin did not arrive as a grand speech, but as a series of small, stubborn actions. Occupying forces quickly organized basic administration, dividing the city into sectors controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Provisional authorities began counting what was left: damaged bridges, destroyed houses, collapsed sewers, broken tram lines. It was like performing an autopsy on a living patient who somehow still breathed. Urban planners drafted ambitious proposals for a completely new Berlin, with wide green spaces and modern traffic arteries replacing the dense pre-war pattern. On paper, the old city almost disappeared, replaced by rational grids and functional zones. Yet reality pushed back. There were not enough materials, not enough machines, not enough time to erase everything and start again. People needed roofs over their heads before winter. Children needed schools, not theoretical models. The decision to rebuild was, therefore, both practical and symbolic. To clear rubble, repair walls, and reconnect streets meant more than physical reconstruction. It meant refusing to let the city remain a monument to destruction, and instead turning it into a place where life could continue. In this fragile moment, reconstruction became a moral act as much as an engineering task. With so many men dead, missing, or prisoners of war, an unexpected army took charge of the first phase of rebuilding: the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. These women, widows, mothers young and elderly, formed chains across bombed-out streets, passing broken bricks from hand to hand under rain, snow, and summer sun. They wore simple headscarves and work clothes, their boots caked in dust, their hands raw from handling sharp stone. They did not use heavy machinery, but patience and rhythm. Bricks were cleaned with hammers and stacked for reuse. Metal was separated for recycling. Entire blocks were slowly cut down from chaotic mounds of debris to more ordered piles. Everywhere, wheelbarrows creaked and wooden carts rolled over uneven ground. In many places, the echo of pickaxes striking mortar replaced the wartime sound of artillery. The same streets that had witnessed bombing now saw strings of women carrying the city's future on their shoulders. This work was poorly paid, often compulsory and physically brutal, yet it laid the foundation for everything that followed. Without this massive clearing operation, nothing could be built, repaired, or modernized. The famous images of rubble women have become symbols of resiliência humana, but behind each photograph was a daily struggle with cold, exhaustion, and grief, carried out in the name of simple survival and the fragile hope of a renascimento urbano. As the Cold War hardened, Berlin's reconstruction became a visible battlefield of ideology. In the East, under Soviet influence, the emerging German Democratic Republic promoted wide avenues, monumental buildings, and standardized apartment blocks as the architecture of socialism. New boulevards were lined with structures that mixed residential space with political symbolism, designed to show the strength and modernity of the new state. Facades were decorated with workers' motifs, and open squares hosted parades and mass demonstrations. In the West, supported by the Marshall Plan, another vision took shape. Here, the focus turned to economic recovery, consumer life, and a more flexible modernism. Commercial districts were revived, department stores reopened, and sleek new buildings rose beside surviving historical fragments. The message was clear. This part of Berlin would stand as a showcase of Western prosperity, a living argument against communist austerity. Neon lights returned to some streets, and shop windows displayed goods that contrasted sharply with shortages on the other side. But for Berliners, daily life was more complex than propaganda posters suggested. Families were split across the city. People crossed sector borders to work or visit relatives until the Berlin Wall suddenly cut through streets and tram lines. The division fossilized two different urban experiences, but it did not erase the shared memory of bombed-out neighborhoods and the long years of clearing rubble. Beneath the contrasting facades, both sides remained tied to the same painful birth of the post-war city. By the late 1950s and 1960s, Berlin no longer looked like a battlefield. New apartment blocks stretched along former front lines, tram lines and roads were repaired, and public transport once again linked distant districts. In the West, cultural institutions reopened, theaters raised their curtains, and universities welcomed students who had been born during or just after the Segunda Guerra Mundial. In the East, Housing projects expanded and factories resumed production, anchoring a socialist everyday life built literally on the rubble of the past. Yet the memoria historica of destruction was never completely buried. Empty lots remained where some buildings once stood, and older residents could still point to places where entire streets had vanished. At night, lights shining from new windows made a powerful contrast with photographs from 1945 showing the same areas in smoke and darkness. Berlin had become a functioning metropolis again, but one in which absence and presence existed side by side. The city's new shape was not simply a return to what had been. It reflected years of fear, hunger, division, and hard work. The story of reconstruction was written in concrete, glass, and brick, but also in the memories of those who had carried stones, rebuilt homes, and tried to raise children amid uncertainty. Berlin's renascimento was and remains inseparable from the trauma that preceded it. In Berlin today, memory is not confined to museums. It is woven into the streets themselves. A bombed church tower left as a broken tooth beside a modern sanctuary, a surviving facade next to a 1950s building, a line of stones marking where the wall once stood. All these elements turn the city into a living archive. Walking through Berlin means moving through layers of time. Imperial facades, Nazi-era ministries, post-war housing, and contemporary glass towers. Monuments and memorial sites mark both German guilt and German suffering, from places recalling the Holocaust to those honoring the dead of air raids and the victims of division. Some former ruinas have been preserved, not because the city could not repair them, but because it chose not to forget. The voids and scars in the urban fabric ask constant questions about responsibility, memory, and the price of rebuilding on such a painful foundation. The rebuilt Berlin stands as a permanent reminder that cities can be shattered and yet live again, but also that rebirth is never simple. Every stone carries a story of those who built the pre-war metropolis, those who destroyed it, those who cleared the rubble, and those who designed the new skyline. In that sense, Berlin is not only a city that survived the bombardeio, but a vast open book about the power and the limits of resiliência humana. The story of how Berlin was rebuilt after WW2 is not a tale of instant redemption, but of long, painful effort. A capital almost erased by total war became, step by step, a functioning metropolis again through the labor of survivors, the decisions of planners, and the competing visions of opposing political systems. The city we see today exists because people refused to accept that rubble would be its final state. Berlin's example shows that cities destroyed by conflict can be reborn, but also that such rebirth demands more than bricks and mortar. It requires a willingness to confront the past, to remember both victims and perpetrators, and to design spaces that speak honestly about what happened. From the Trümmerfrauen to the architects of the post-war decades, each generation added a chapter to this ongoing memoria historica. If this documentary expanded your view of how a devastated city can rise again from ruinas, consider subscribing to the channel to follow other stories of destruction, reconstruction, and the human capacity to rebuild what seemed lost forever.